Вот. Но пока я бы хотела представить Ричарда Рейнольдса, партизанского садовода, создателя движения Guerilla Gardening из Великобритании. Ричард расскажет о партизанском садоводстве как двигатель городских изменений.
Okay, hello everyone. Can everyone hear me clearly? The sound is, yes, a few thumbs up. And the interpreter can hear me too? Lots of nodding, brilliant. Okay, hello, thank you for coming and thank you to the organisers for bringing me here, to Lolia and Anton especially. I'm going to talk about gardening, specifically guerrilla gardening. The usual definition of guerrilla gardening is gardening land that is not yours and not asking permission first. That's the accepted definition. And there are thousands of guerrilla gardeners around the world. I'm just one of them. I've been doing it for nearly 10 years. But I have really accidentally found myself speaking about it a lot, and I'm going to tell you how that came to happen. I describe myself as an accidental activist. I don't see myself doing stuff that's usually described as art. It's not my job, it's an obsession, it's a hobby, and it's something that, as well as enjoying doing, I am keen for others to do as well, whatever their motivation. And that's something I'm going to touch on during this presentation. There are many different motivations for why people guerrilla garden. I don't share my motivations with all guerrilla gardeners, but that's fine. It's still, to me, a very interesting activity that people are driven to plant things in places that could get them in trouble, or could mean that their garden doesn't even last, that it's a very temporary thing sometimes. And my focus is going to be on the guerrilla gardening in London, in New York, and in Georgia, particularly in Tbilisi, of which has been quite a lot in the last year. But I have a few other little examples as well. So here, this is an example. This is me doing guerrilla gardening. You can see as a DIY activity. It's not just about having the skills of a gardener. In this case, it's about the carpentry and building a raised bed. But the DIY skills are also about communication. While some guerrilla gardeners I meet really just focus on the gardening, there are many for whom the message of what they're doing is important too. Like a graffiti artist who is painting a symbol or writing words, some guerrilla gardeners want that message to get across. And my day job is in communications. I work in advertising, which for some people here might be considered evil. I've made ads that you may have even seen on Russian television for soy sauce, Pickerman soy sauce. But I use some of those skills to communicate why people should be growing things wherever they see the opportunity. And of course I use my income from that to pay for the gardening too, because it seldom pays the bills. And why do I do it? I do it initially simply because I love gardening. Nothing more radical than that. Loving gardening, this is me and my twin brother as we were little, and yet finding myself like an increasing number of the world's population living in a big block with no garden. This is where I live, in London, in a district called the Elephant and Castle, a building built in the 1970s, and increasingly London and cities around the world are building taller and taller to accommodate populations, which makes the ground, which makes the earth where we can grow things even more precious. Precious for food, precious as space to congregate in, precious as space to be creative in, and precious for plant life too. So as a gardener, in my genes, in my childhood, living here, which was cheap and straightforward, was frustrating because I had no garden, but the opportunity was very obvious. in this little space initially outside. This was meant to be the job of the local council, of the local authorities. Me and my neighbours were paying them to do this, but they weren't doing the job. And you'll see that as a theme. For many guerrilla gardeners, we are simply doing a job that should be done by the authorities, but we're doing it instead. And I would say generally doing it better, but also having a lot of positive side effects along the way, the social side of it, and having the opportunity to garden in the way that we want rather than how we are told. And that's what it has become, and it's one tiny space in a much bigger area that me and many others, Lila who's here, have helped garden, and we now have permission. After 3 years the council said this is okay, you don't have to pay us anything, we're not going to pay you, they don't pay us anything to do this, but they just let it happen, which is, for me, is like a victory. It's the freedom to do it as we want. And they said that if we asked first, they would not have said yes. But it's because we showed our enthusiasm, our commitment, that they could see the results, and it made it very difficult for them to say no. So this is what I could call soft guerrilla gardening. This is not that controversial. This is quite easy for the officials to say yes. You know, this is great. You know, you're saving us money. You're saving us time, and they accept the form it takes. It doesn't look like the city have done it. It looks more flamboyant. And so I've spread to other locations, and this is a map of the neighbourhood that I live in with the labels showing some of those other guerrilla gardens. Almost all of them still have no permission, and I will show some images for those later on. But before I do that, I'm going to talk a bit about other areas. So how I come to be here is that when I started doing this as a personal hobby, I was blogging about it, just simply an online diary of the fun that I was having, and partly motivated as an insurance in case the gardens got destroyed. I was keen that there would be a record of them on the web so that I could show what had been there. And generally the gardens have not been destroyed, and I discovered that there were other people guerrilla gardening in other parts of the world. One result of the website was that I got asked to write a book, and I have a few copies here. This includes a lot of other stories that I was fortunate enough to discover because people would share with me what they had been doing. And now there are groups, as I said, all over the world. These are ones who care about the communications of their activity as well, so that they're very visible. These are logos of groups from around the world, just a few of the groups that are active, many of whom, of course, have social media pages, because they want other people to join in, or they want people to see what they've done so that it's a way of protecting their work, of people understanding that this garden was made by volunteers. The origins of guerrilla gardening go back, well, the word goes back to the 1970s. And this is a little case study about the guerrilla gardening that's emerged in New York in the 1970s. Now, New York back then was a very different city. It had even less money than it has now. It wasn't poor, but it was a city that didn't have the resources to be cleaning a lot. People were not clearing the waste, and a lot of people were abandoning New York and leaving derelict buildings. And what had been a building here had been demolished, and a group of artists and students went in 1973 and turned this waste space into a garden. And they called themselves the Green Guerrillas. And initially they were ignored, then the media was interested, and then the city, after a year, decided that this was okay, this was something that they would let happen, because the land, which had been private, had now become public, because the owner was not paying their taxes. So there was an informal, simple, short-term arrangement for the guerrilla gardeners to carry on gardening with the city. But what that meant was that whilst the gardens could initially thrive, they were, of course, vulnerable for the city changing their mind and perhaps building on it as well. And as New York's economy developed in the 1980s, so the demand to build on this land grew. And then the guerrilla gardeners had to become more militant. And there are stories from about 15 years ago when the mayor at the time wanted to clear away a lot of these gardens, which had been there, 25 years by this point, provided very valuable community space in a very densely built city. Places to grow, to hang out, to meet people, for theatre, for barbecue. And so people in some gardens, more community gardens for example, chain themselves to the shrubberies, build themselves tree houses, and created a lot of noise and a lot of protest to save these spaces. And luckily, the election at the time voted in Mayor Bloomberg, who could see the value of these, and it was 30 years it took for guerrilla gardens in New York. Hundreds of them, the spaces were finally declared official community gardens, which meant that they had a lot more protection. So the war, as one might describe it, isn't necessarily won quickly, but for me the story from New York is very inspiring. And when I went to visit and research this, I met a very inspiring man called Adam Honigman, who was very involved in the garden in Hell's Kitchen, the Clinton community garden. And he was full of advice. He said, sometimes you must just let the authorities feel that they have won. If your ego can take it, let them feel that they're Caesar, he said. But keep clear in your mind what your motivations are. And for him it was creating this very welcoming garden space in Hell's Kitchen. Little touches like signs in many languages, spaces for gardeners, all sorts of ability to find a way of tending spaces. And the garden is well worth the visit. It's still, of course, very much there today. The Green Guerrillas, who were radical in the 70s, are now very grown up, and they have a website. This is the website as it is today. They're an NGO, so they've matured. It's followed a trajectory that some guerrilla gardens follow, like the one outside my block, although we're not an NGO by any means. Another thing that this group helped popularise is a methodology of guerrilla gardening if you're feeling nervous about spending long in an area. It's called seed bombing. You've probably heard about it. There are websites with recipes and YouTube demonstrations. It's just a way of getting seeds and soil into places that you don't want to linger or you can't get to, like over a fence or out of a train window. This is a more radical version, again from America. This is the work of an architect called Christopher Hughes in Richmond, Virginia, which the Americans like, of course. And interestingly, despite the development of guerrilla gardening in New York from something radical in the 70s to something more accepted and traditional now, of course there's still occasions when that radical approach is applied. And these are images from Occupy Wall Street, where the activity of making seed bombs was a way of bringing people together, keeping them busy, giving them a sense of positive purpose. Sow seeds, not greed, and there you go, a little sign advertising the workshop and seed bombs being made. I haven't seen where they threw them or if they worked, but just the activity of making them is a good feeling. Here's some surprising history, perhaps, that links guerrilla gardening in Britain with guerrilla gardening, well, with Bosco, basically. This was a very surprising story that I discovered about 6 years ago. So the original guerrilla gardener, before New York, before the term guerrilla existed, is actually, in my view, a man from 17th century England called Gerard Winstanley. And he was motivated not by just making the area look nicer, as I had been, or by the love of gardening, but by the need for food. So in 1649, food prices in England were very, very high. There had been very bad harvests, as there were actually in many parts of the world, that part of the century. Food prices were high. There had been a revolution. We just executed our king, King Charles I, and there were a lot of radicals looking to reinvent society, redesign it. And so they began planting vegetables in public land, and this painting marks that occasion. And when Stanley also wrote a lot, he was into the communications of it to inspire other people. This created the movement known as the Diggers across southeast England. And what is surprising is that although this man is not well known in Britain at all, is that he was actually an inspiration to Karl Marx. And so his name is on an obelisk outside the Kremlin. The first memorial to the revolution of 1917 actually includes this man's name. And I went to visit it 6 years ago. This is a really short, slightly silly video I made in 2008 by the memorial, where me and a couple of colleagues who were with me from the British Council decided we would do some guerrilla gardening next to the obelisk, just as a token effort. Partly to see also whether we could get away with it in such a symbolic place. Would anyone stop us? We didn't take any precautions other than going at night. We didn't wear any high-vis jackets. In a way, actually, I was quite looking forward to having a conversation with someone and reassuring them that we were simply planting tulip bulbs, red tulips. And that's another still for the video. I've never seen whether it worked, but I'm going to go back to this site tomorrow and see if there's any evidence of these tulips coming through, albeit it's now 6 years later. So sometimes the guerrilla gardening, the action is more important than the end result, although that's not usually the case for me. So linking that action with another symbolic gesture rather than really serious gardening, I was invited to Tbilisi 4 years ago for a project that was not about guerrilla gardening, but I decided to do a little bit while I was there and recorded planting a little rosemary bush, a herb rosemary, in Freedom Square in a planter that was really messy. And again, I was interested to see whether anyone would chat to me, whether anyone would take an interest in seeing this person who was quite clearly not professional doing it. No one took any interest at all, which was really quite boring. But many thousands of people have found this video and they've watched it. And last summer I was invited back to Tbilisi to do some cleaning up. It was a project organised by a group called GeoAir, and they wanted me to come back and help clean up a mountainous village called Mestia in the Caucasus. And when I was there, I got to meet a new group of guerrilla gardeners who had seen this video I'd made 4 years before. And this is them today. This is their Facebook page. You can see they are very popular, and that's because they're doing really serious guerrilla gardening. They've got a very clear purpose, which goes beyond just making the city more beautiful, and I will tell you their story now. So originally, and it was Nata Paradze, who was a teacher and an experienced gardener, she was very concerned that in Tbilisi, a lot of the trees are being chopped down. It's really crazy. They're not just even removing them, they just chop them down. You can be walking along and just see these tree trunks as if they've been felled in the forest. And Tbilisi is in a country that is famous for beautiful landscape. Georgia's got a wonderful climate, a very diverse ecosystem. But the city is increasingly environmentally degraded. And there are some figures here which I will have to read. The amount of green space in Tbilisi has been shrinking. So in Soviet times, they recommended you needed about 15 square meters of green space per person in a city. And in 1983, it was only 13. But by 13 years ago, by 2001, it had fallen to 5.6. So Nata and the guerrilla gardeners were concerned that this was falling even more with this tree felling. So they began their guerrilla gardening by going around planting new trees, which is a brilliant project. Great fun to plant, but a serious long-term investment. And when I met her, that's what they'd been doing. And I have a few photos of the little action we did in Mestia. This was mainly about clearing the plastic waste from the mountainous streams. It's a really beautiful landscape that's been ruined by people there throwing all their rubbish into the rivers. So a group of us cleared it up, and with the rubbish we used it for decoration. Initially just using the glass bottles to edge this planter, which we planted later on. And then we also made this garland, we call it the garland of shame, to hang in the town square, albeit it's a nice leafy town square. But we put this up and it was taken down the next morning. We saw people from the village, the officials clearing it. But this was all saved from the streams. So this was just a simple temporary action to try and inspire people there to care for their environment. And that's Nata doing some gardening with the local children. But since I saw them in the summer, it's become really serious, because in Tbilisi, one of the parks, which I think is pronounced Bak Park or Bake Park, is being threatened by a hotel development called the Budapest Hotel, who want to annex it as a courtyard. And so a massive protest, which is more like an Occupy movement, has taken place, where people have been camped in this park to save it, and the Guerilla Gardeners now have made this their mission. So the gardening is a way of showing people they're not just protesting, they're doing something positive. You know, they know how to be green, they can plant trees, they're investing their time and their money, which gives this message, I think, even more credibility, because it's not just protest, it's a positive action as well. And here are some more images. And here's Nata speaking to a crowd. And this now looks, this is well beyond gardening, this is serious campaigning and politics. And I discovered Nata's getting the message out now through that international medium of lecturing, through the TEDx talks. So if you speak Georgian, there's 20 minutes worth online, although the pictures show a lot. So we'll come back now to London, where although my gardening is very seldom affected by the law, and that's because most of what I do is simply seeking to make my local community a nicer place to look at, more nature friendly, and of course the action of doing it is a fun social activity. I have, almost as a reminder that this is technically criminal damage, I have had my one encounter with the police in a serious way. So I show this just to justify why I call myself a guerrilla gardener, but not to show you that this is what normally happens, certainly not in the UK anyway. So there they are, there are the police. There's a video about this on YouTube. And to give the police some credit, they didn't destroy the garden's still there. It's a small garden on a roundabout in my area. And I think that partly the police's problem was they were on camera. So that's where the balance between spreading your message needs to be balanced with your pragmatic objective. Do you want the garden to succeed or not? And this garden was a risk because the police felt awkwardly embarrassed that they needed to be seen to be doing the professional thing. But we got away with it. We stopped gardening, we went home, we went back later when the police had gone, and as I said, the garden's still there. This is a surprisingly successful one-season garden. This is obviously opposite our Houses of Parliament. This is 7 years ago, at a time when the public space there was very neglected, really surprising for a big city in a very public place. But we were successfully able to sow sunflower seeds in May, and no one touched them. No one official came along and cleared it away, which if they were doing their normal job would have been weeded before they even knew what they were. And this to me is a sign that it is amazing what you can get away with. Not that this is controversial, of course, everyone generally benefits from this, although I know a few people just hate sunflowers, they find them scary. But if you like sunflowers, this isn't controversial, but it's surprising the neglect that enables you to create something that you like in the city instead. And then I'll show you the story. This is the biggest one that I've been involved in. Again, very central London. This was the boring starting point. It's not inspiring, it's not that good for nature. Rather like we heard earlier from Daniel, the grey steps in Brazil. This is just dark and low maintenance, cheap for the city. So we went in over 4 nights and dug up the grass and put in a lot of fragrant and colourful plants. We used a lot of lavender, and this is it 2 years later. So this was something we've had to commit to and go back to a lot, but it's a very sociable space to hang out. I sometimes go on my own and just start chatting to passers-by. Other times we organise gardening through the web. Here are some more pictures of it. And we've also grown some food. Mostly what I do in London is ornamental because it's very polluted. But occasionally a bit of snack food is quite fun. And if someone else wants to pick it, that's fine. You see some guerrilla gardeners in parts of the world that food is the main motivation. And we harvest the lavender. This actually provides us an income, which was a surprise. We didn't plan it that way, but someone pointed out that lavender had value. So we cut it in the summer and we make it into these fragrant pillows, which we then sell. Now, whilst most of what I do in London is without permission, there are some areas where this has now been encouraged by the authorities. So rather like in New York, after 30 years, the authorities legitimised these spaces in a more permanent way. In Lambeth, which is the neighbouring authorities where I live, they now encourage people to plant in the streets. And here are some portraits of people proudly standing next to their little miniature pavement gardens, which don't get vandalised and bring joy and nature into concrete. There are loads more stories through Guerilla Gardening. There's the book as well. And I'm just going to show you a few quick ones that are not part of those main stories because they're kind of fun and show you the more radical side of it. This is a recent image that I heard about from Ukraine. This is Guerilla Gardening in potholes, which has been done in other parts of the world, but here the motivation was to draw attention to the poor condition of the roads. So in a way this is a gardening action that is pro-motorist, which might confuse some people, but if you think about it, you're upset with the roads, how will you inspire people to hear about your concern with something that is humorous and joyful and thought-provoking? So that's in Ukraine. This is an old example from America. This is a Mercedes logo by their dealership. A guerrilla gardener called Sandy, during the time of the Second Gulf War, changed that into a peace symbol, which Mercedes left there for 2 weeks. They may have thought that this is good corporate advertising. And then this is an action from a British guerrilla gardener and artist called Paul Hartreet. He's a friend of mine, and we were together at a festival in Austria 2 years ago. And he plants pansies, which is a flower that shares its name with the abusive term for homosexual people. And he plants these in places as a memorial where there's been some kind of aggressive attack. And sadly, this happens all over the world. Of course, it happens in Russia, and it happens in Austria too. This is a video you can see on YouTube of Paul planting pansies to mark these actions. Finally, on May the 1st, it's International Sunflower Guerilla Gardening Day. This is a day that the Belgian guerrilla gardeners invented 8 years ago. The idea is that all of us in the northern hemisphere, where it's suitable, can sow sunflowers. May the 1st is a good date. It's obviously symbolic for other reasons. They declared that day, and I helped spread the word about it. These are images from London. These are images from guerrilla gardeners around the world. We've got Poland represented there, Scotland, Bangalore, even Uruguay, which is the wrong side of the equator. I had an email from someone last week actually, I think in Argentina, saying, can we plant them? So you can try, nature would sow them in autumn, it might work. And I've got loads of sunflower seeds with me, so if you want some, I do not want to leave this country with any of them. They're free to take. And there's a Facebook page. We've nearly got 1,000 people who've signed up in the last 3 weeks to do this. It's so simple. You can do it on your own, you can do it with friends, you can do it with strangers. And yeah, that's the end. That's the last slide. I'll leave that one. Okay. I think the warning sign saying I'm running out of time. We've got 5 minutes now for the questions discussion, if you like. Would you like to put up your hand if you have a question? You have some seeds. Brilliant. Are you Moscow Guerilla Gardeners? Yes, okay. Do you want to say a few words about what you've been doing? Okay. Okay. We have local guerrilla gardeners here who have plants for you to have for free to make it even easier, so there's no excuse why you can't be a guerrilla gardener. Is it fair to say Moscow has many other posters too? Brilliant. I look forward to finding out more about what you're doing. That's partly why I've come here. I see, and you have a stand downstairs that's the display with the illustrations. Other questions here?
The question for me for discussion is about, if I understand well, you have a discussion here on another lecture about when we should act ourselves or when we should push the local authorities to act themselves. That will make them act. And do you think it's important? Which is more important? Do you see that this job is improved after your action at the moment? And also, there are questions about your rules when they can purchase or.
Well, I think it comes, so the question is about, should you be getting the city to do it? Is that what this is about, or is it about doing it yourself? Well, for me, it's very much about doing it yourself. So it comes down to what your motivations are. I like gardening. I like spending time doing it. So I don't want the city to do it. I really don't. And I've had discussions in interesting conferences where my vision is that the city, actually, Moscow is at this point in the year, is exactly how I would like many cities to be in this climate. There are so many empty flower beds. The soil is there, like hundreds, lots of these planters, these granite planters, concrete planters, all the way down the street, empty except for soil. Now, I would love a city where people then go and do the rest. And every street could look different. You could have lots of sunflowers down one, lavender in another, but these areas take on the character of the people who live there. And the city just does the really hard bits of providing the infrastructure. And that they would trust their citizens to do it in a way that didn't cause too much disturbance, didn't necessarily block the vision of pedestrians crossing the road and that kind of thing. And that's where in some places like Vancouver, I write about that in the book, Vancouver enabled this to happen, could adopt these spaces, said it now, pretty relaxed. They give you the soil, they give you the edge, and then they let you get on with it. And then the money that's costing them to do it could be spent on things that is more difficult to do in a DIY way. The gardening is for many people a luxury, a pleasure. We should be able to share in that, even if we don't have a garden of our own. And that's what the street is for. And then you get all the positive side effects as well, of meeting people. And I met my wife in the street gardening. It's one of the many
Есть еще 2 минутки на один вопрос.
So the books, there are the version here is English, but it's also in German and French and Korean. I just bought 3 with me, but we had an accident earlier and some of them got very wet, although I think they've dried off now. I feel if these guys don't have one yet, I'll just give them away. I have one. And I think the people who invited me, I think I'll just give these away to my nominated people I should be thankful. But if you want to buy one, they're available online through my website, guerillagardening.org, on Guerilla Gardening, which is the name. If you speak German, that's the best edition. It's got more pictures in. That looks about it, okay? Thank you very much. Have a good day. Please come and go around to the we'll just wrap them up in paper, you know, make a little envelope.